Hello and welcome to the Manager Q Sprint 173 review. I can't believe it's already 173. Amazing. So this was a regular 2-week sprint. As usual, I'll provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on the platform, API, and the developer experience. So this sprint, we had 127 pull requests merged and 129 pull requests opened. So as you can see, that number is higher than pretty much all the previous sprints except for 172. So I like the pace. It is increasing. Last sprint, we had to deal with a security issue that probably consumed, I don't know, almost a third of those pull requests, since they affected every single repo that we have. Yeah, so we're in a good pace here. So out of those pull requests, 56 were enhancements, 27 were bug fixes, and the rest sprinkled around. So as Morphe is getting stabilized and we work towards a candidate release for the community, we're at the same time turning our attention to the end release, which is going to be Nightorf. And with that, I will turn it over to Kavya.
Thanks, Oleg. Good afternoon, everyone. This sprint total 18 PRs got merged, 9 bugs, 7 enhancements, and so on. Next slide, please. So when breadcrumbs clicked from network services summary page, it was broken. Mengshi fixed that here. Next slide. Storage manager summary page, when host initiators link clicked from that, we got table, but configuration button is missing, and so AutoSD team fixed that here. Advanced search model on advanced search model left side is hiding under menu, so Jeffrey fixed that issue here. In provider edit form, we get disabled type field, but it was showing an empty type, so Melody fixed that issue here. This is an enhancement. Mengshi converted all Patternfly React buttons to Carbon. This screenshot has an example, like how it looks. Yep. Next slide. Gilbert converted tagging form to Carbon. Earlier, we are using third-party package called React Select. So with this PR, we are able to get rid of that package and use Carbon. Next slide. Gilbert also converted all Patternfly React models to Carbon models, which also fixed accessibility issue for us. Next one. AutoSD team contributed this one. So when ports are available, we are calling an API and displaying it in a drop-down to select one of those. Earlier, I think we have only ability to input custom port address, but now we have both. We can either input custom one or we can choose if they are available. I think that's all from UI. With that, over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So this sprint for providers in core, Keenan introduced a few PRs to improve the code that allows particularly API and UI callers to find a specific provider subclass for a particular model type. Previously, this was done by passing the EMS into a method off of that model. So it was essentially hard coding the logic for subclassing in core. This is now owned by the EMS, and so allows EMS provider plugins to override this logic if they have some special casing that needs to be done. He also converted the supported for catalog methods to use supports feature mixin, as opposed to just looking for the presence of a defined method in the EMS. Let's see. It looks like Oleg removed some unused supports methods that used to be used by the UI. He also deleted some unused modules from Cloud Subnet operations that is no longer being called by anyone. And he converted all callers of supports feature, the full out name, to use the newer, more preferred supports method passing in the feature. This is going to allow us to do some future cleanup. Now that we've gotten rid of all of those, we don't have to predefine a bunch of methods for all of the features that get defined. For Ansible Tower this sprint, I fixed the bug to handle nil extra variables coming back. Previously, this was being persisted to the database and was causing failures in the UI as well as in the ordering of service. Next slide. The AutoSC team added host initiator groups, which is a more convenient way of handling a group of hosts that are allowed to connect to a storage slice, so that it's easier to manage. You don't have to do it one at a time. You can work on the entire group of hosts if they all have access to it. They also fixed queuing a refresh from a physical storage object. It was calling a local variable that wasn't being set, and so they just switched it to use the XD management system. They also updated the VCRs and are using a newer SDK version. They changed the name of the flushed system service format that gets returned, and that was causing failures in the refresh specs for that provider. For IBM Cloud, the VPC side this sprint, Nasser added network ACLs, which are security group rules. And also we're now parsing the public gateway attributes for the network routers on that side. He also added VPC load balancers. So we ticked off a couple enhancements off of that for the Morphe branch, or sorry, for the next branch. Power Virtual Systems, they're now using private key authentication for the image import workflow. This is being passed by the user in the when they add the provider. They're adding an additional authentication to the to that provider to be able to do image import, and now they're pulling that in and passing that down to the Ansible runner workflow. They also improved error messaging, propagating up to the MIQ task and setting the status and the message properly when the import workflow fails. Next slide. For IBM Power HMC, they're now displaying operating system info, so the name of the OS, the version, the build number, etc. For the HMC VMs. They also added the ability to rename VMs and added some additional information, particularly partition ID and reference code to HMC VMs in advanced settings. These are properties which don't really map well to any other attributes of VMs and are only used for additional display, and so they put them in advanced settings as opposed to adding it to the another column of the model. Openstack, we fixed a bug where the orchestrate destroy was failing, so you couldn't remove an Openstack provider because the enabled column wasn't being synced with the child managers. So during the deletion of a VM, when we went to change the zone to be the maintenance zone, that was failing and rolling back on a validation that you could only have a disabled provider in the maintenance zone. So now we fixed that, and you can delete OpenStacks again. Keenan also added params for create and update to network routers, so that can be called by the API. And he also, along with an older PR by Dan Berger, fixed a shadowed exception in snapshot create and delete calls. Next slide. For VMware, the sprint, I added the VMware Tanzu support as a VMware container manager. So this is available to be installed into your Vsphere cluster if you have the proper licensing. It's called workload management, but the Tanzu is the backend technology name. So it allows you to have access to essentially a Kubernetes-like API and a Kubernetes cluster mixed in with your Vsphere ESXi hosts. Uses the same credentials as your Vsphere provider. You only have to enter the IP address of the Tanzu cluster, since you can have multiples per provider. We also pulled in support for Vsphere 7.0 update 3, which was released recently. So it was added to the RB VMO gem last sprint, but we pulled in the gem update this sprint. And for the RB VMO 2 gem, which we are updating, we added rake tasks to verify that a vmodal Marshall database is valid and correct, as well as allowing for generating a vmodal DB from a set of official SDK WSDL definitions. So when VMware comes out with a new version of Vsphere, they release the updated WSDLs. And so you just have to run a rake task, point it at those WSDL files, and it will add whatever new updated models and methods that were added as part of the new version automatically into the vmodal database. This just makes it much easier to keep things up to date, reduces the chances of screwing something up if you're editing it by hand, automates the process and makes it much easier to use. And that's it for providers. Over to Jason.
All right, thanks, Adam. On the platform side, Brandon upgraded our Memcache client, Dali, to version 3. Version 3 brings in SSL support, so where we can use SSL between our application and Memcache, that was added as well. As Adam said, the AutoSDE team introduced host initiator groups, and Nazar added associations for the cloud network to firewall rules, so that we can get cloud network security added. Excuse me. Adam made a change to core to convert our MIQ server worker management to a class. It was the first part of sort of breaking up our worker management into Kubernetes systemd and process subclasses, so we can more accurately separate the code into how we launch on these different platforms. And then hopefully the more improvements can come from this initial refactoring. Brandon made a change to upgrade the application build to Ruby 2.7. Ruby 2.6 is going to be going into maintenance mode rather soon. So we want to make sure we bumped the builds to Ruby 2.7 for the next release. We still have to get Ruby 3.0 support eventually completed. He also made a change to fix PPC64 and S390X builds. There was a hack that we had in order to get that in, but the hack was done in a way where it was actually introducing the code in the wrong line. So he fixed that and made sure that it was in the correct location. And he also made a change to the RPM builds to drop bundler version overrides and use the version installed by the Docker file. So it'll automatically figure out which bundler we're supposed to use and then use that to build the gemset RPM. Next slide, please. Akil fixed a bug on the automation engine where arrays of strings, if those strings had commas in them, would cause a problem because comma was also being used as the separator for the array elements. And so they would deserialize incorrectly. It was switched to using a special control character, I think ASCII X1F, and that way it shouldn't collide with any real world data. And that allows comma entries to work correctly. Finally, Joe added a small warning that the DB is not seated if there are no servers in the region. This can happen in weird edge cases where, especially if you're using an external database and then you try to connect to the database, or sorry, using an exported database and you try to connect to the database, your particular server is not seated and it can cause a bunch of problems. So this will prevent that from happening. Next slide, please. On the API side, Keenan added a change to add an options call for the network routers endpoint. This goes to the work that Gilbert was working on to update the cloud network screen and a number of other networking screens. The options call will return the params for create and params for update that Adam mentioned previously. And Keenan also made a change to condense the delete action handler. There was a lot of code duplication in the API, and this consolidated it into a single method. And then it also helps when we're adding new things that we make sure that the RBAC is done correctly and isn't missed. Next slide, please. On the developer side, Keenan added a change, an option for developers if they want to hide instantiation messages. When running a server or a console, you can pass MIQ quiet equals true. Below that is 2 log messages that you normally see in the Rails log. MIQ quiet true will remove the second message, which may not be necessary if you're trying to focus on just the SQL queries and not so much the results that come back. Joe added a change to add the routes lazy routes gem. This should help us have faster dev test boot time because it removes route loading, or rather it lazy loads routes until you need them. This is especially useful in Rails console, where you generally don't need routes at all. And our routes are rather expensive. He found this saved about a second on boot time for Rails console, which is about, I think, 25% or so. Routes lazy routes is still kind of an experimental gem. So if you're seeing problems, we can always remove it and make sure you let us know. And finally, I added support for bundler D in the options dir in the RPM build. In the RPM build, we had a way for after the source code is checked out, there's a hook where you can modify the source code, but almost 95% of the usage of this was just to add the bundler D directory so that we can insert our own custom gems, or if you're doing local development on gems and you want to override the defaults. And so I bumped that up to be a more first-class citizen and make it a little bit more obvious on how to do that. And that's it on the developer side.
Very good. And that brings sprint 173 to a close. Next sprint review will be in 2 weeks on November the 10th. Same time, same Zoom session. And with that, I want to thank everyone, the contributors, the speakers, and the rest of the ManagerQ community for making Sprint 173 possible. Thanks, everyone.